Sarah Martinez had been working in the Army mess hall for 3 months when everything changed. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her busy while she figured out her next move in life. At 24, she had already served 2 tours overseas as a communications specialist before deciding military life wasn't for her. Now, as a civilian contractor, she found herself back on base, serving meals to the same type of soldiers she once was. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at 5:30, tied her dark hair back in a regulation bun, and put on her hairnet and apron. The industrial kitchen was already buzzing with activity as the cooking staff prepared breakfast for nearly 2,000 personnel. Steam rose from massive pots of scrambled eggs, and the smell of bacon filled the air. She took her usual position behind the serving line, armed with a large spoon and practiced smile. The soldiers filed through in their typical morning rush, most barely making eye contact as they mumbled their requests. Some she recognized as regulars who always asked for extra portions or specific items. Others were new faces, fresh recruits who still looked overwhelmed by military life. Sarah had developed a routine over the months. She would serve efficiently, exchange brief pleasantries when appropriate, and keep the line moving. The work was repetitive, but she found a strange comfort in the predictability. After the chaos and uncertainty of her deployment years, there was something soothing about knowing exactly what each day would bring. Around 7:15, the breakfast rush was in full swing when she noticed a commotion near the entrance. Several soldiers straightened their posture and began speaking in hushed, respectful tones. Sarah looked up from the serving tray to see a distinguished older man in dress uniform making his way toward the serving line. Even from a distance, the stars on his shoulders were unmistakable. General Robert Harrison was a legend on the base. Sarah had heard stories about him during her time as an active soldier, but had never seen him in person. He was known for his hands-on leadership style and his habit of eating with the troops rather than in the officers' dining facility. At 58, he carried himself with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of military service and multiple combat deployments. As the general approached her section of the serving line, Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. She had served officers before, but never anyone of this rank. She focused on maintaining her professional demeanor, straightening her shoulders, and preparing to serve whatever he requested. The general moved through the line systematically, speaking briefly with each server, and accepting portions of various items onto his tray. When he reached Sarah's station, which featured the main breakfast entrees, he looked up and met her eyes with a polite nod. "Good morning," he said in a voice that was both commanding and surprisingly warm. "I'll take some of those scrambled eggs, please." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, reaching for the serving spoon. As she leaned forward to scoop the eggs onto his plate, the sleeve of her uniform shirt rode up slightly, exposing her left forearm. The general's eyes immediately locked onto her exposed skin, and Sarah noticed his expression change dramatically. What had been a routine morning interaction suddenly became something entirely different. His professional composure remained intact, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his gaze as he stared at the tattoo that adorned her forearm. The tattoo was a detailed military insignia, but not just any insignia. It was the specific emblem of the 82nd Airborne Division's 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, surrounded by dates and coordinates that held deep personal significance. Below the main design in elegant script were the words, "Never Forgotten," and a list of names that meant everything to Sarah. General Harrison's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly as he continued to stare at the tattoo. The aluminum tray he was holding suddenly seemed to become too heavy for his grip. Other soldiers in line behind him began to notice the unusual pause, craning their necks to see what had captured the general's attention so completely. Sarah became increasingly uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. She had finished serving the eggs and was waiting for him to move on, but he seemed frozen in place. The tattoo had always been deeply personal to her, and having it examined so closely by a high-ranking officer she didn't know made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Sir?" she ventured quietly, hoping to break whatever spell had taken hold of him. The sound of her voice seemed to shake him from his trance, but instead of moving on, he took a half-step closer to the serving counter. His eyes never left her forearm as he studied every detail of the intricate design. The dates, the coordinates, the names. Everything seemed to hold profound meaning for him. The mess hall had grown quieter as more people noticed the unusual interaction taking place at the serving line. Conversations died down, and even the kitchen staff began to peer out from their stations to see what was happening. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her and wished desperately that she could somehow make this moment end. General Harrison's breathing had become slightly irregular, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The tray in his hands continued to shake, causing the items already on it to shift and rattle against the aluminum surface. "Where did you—" he began, his voice uncharacteristically hoarse. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Sarah was taken aback by the personal nature of the question. Military protocol didn't typically involve high-ranking officers questioning civilian contractors about their personal choices in body art. She glanced around nervously, aware that their interaction was becoming increasingly public. It's personal, sir," she managed to reply, her own voice barely above a whisper. The general's grip on his tray loosened further, and Sarah could see that he was struggling to maintain his composure. Whatever significance her tattoo held for him was clearly overwhelming. The aluminum tray tilted precariously in his shaking hands as he leaned even closer, trying to read the smaller text within the design. The names inscribed beneath the main emblem seemed to affect him most profoundly. Sarah watched in growing alarm as his face went pale and his breathing became more labored. The tray was now shaking so violently that she feared he might collapse entirely. Other soldiers in the immediate area had begun to notice their commanding officer's distress, though none dared to approach or interrupt. The mess hall had fallen into an eerie silence, with only the distant sounds of kitchen activity continuing in the background. Sarah realized she needed to do something before the situation escalated further. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, genuine concern overriding her earlier discomfort. But General Harrison seemed unable to hear her. His entire focus remained fixed on the tattoo, specifically on the list of names that held such deep meaning for Sarah. One name in particular seemed to capture his attention, and as he read it, his face crumpled with an emotion that was unmistakably grief. The tray slipped from his trembling fingers, crashing to the floor with a resounding clang that echoed through the now silent mess hall. Food scattered across the polished floor, and the sound seemed to break whatever trance had held everyone in its grip. Soldiers immediately moved to attention, unsure whether they should help clean up or maintain their distance from the clearly distraught general. Sarah stood frozen behind the serving counter, her tattoo still partially visible, unsure of what had just happened or what she should do next. The general remained motionless, staring down at the spilled food at his feet. His chest rising and falling with the effort of controlling his emotions. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft sound of General Harrison's labored breathing and the distant clatter of kitchen equipment. Everyone in the mess hall waited for someone to make the first move, to somehow address what had just occurred, but no one seemed to know how to proceed. The crash of the tray hitting the floor seemed to snap General Harrison back to reality. He blinked several times, looking around the mess hall as if seeing it for the first time. The sea of concerned faces staring back at him reminded him where he was and what had just happened. His years of military training kicked in, and he straightened his posture, though Sarah could see the effort it took. "At ease," he said quietly to the room. though his voice still carried that unmistakable tremor. Soldiers immediately began to move again, some helping to clean up the spilled food while others resumed their breakfast routines, though many continued to steal glances in their direction. Sarah remained behind the serving counter, her heart racing as she watched the general compose himself. She had pulled her sleeve down to cover the tattoo, but she could tell he was still thinking about what he had seen. The way he kept looking at her forearm, even though it was now hidden, told her this wasn't over. "Miss," General Harrison said, his voice stronger now but still carrying an emotional weight that hadn't been there before. "I apologize for the disruption. That was unprofessional of me." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to ask what had affected him so deeply, but military protocol and common sense told her to let the matter drop. "It's all right, sir. These things happen." But the general didn't move away from the serving line. Instead, he glanced around the busy mess hall and seemed to make a decision. "I wonder if I might speak with you privately when your shift ends. Would that be possible?" The request caught Sarah completely off guard. In all her time working at the mess hall, no officer had ever asked to speak with her outside of work, let alone a general. The personal nature of his interest in her tattoo made the situation even more unusual. Yes, sir? My shift ends at 2 this afternoon." "Excellent. Would you meet me in my office at 14:30 hours? Building 12, second floor." Sarah nodded, though her mind was racing with questions and concerns. "Yes, sir." General Harrison picked up a new tray and moved through the rest of the serving line, but Sarah noticed he barely looked at the food being placed on his plate. His mind was clearly elsewhere, and she suspected she knew exactly what he was thinking about. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur. Word of the unusual interaction had spread quickly through the mess hall staff, and she found herself fielding curious questions from her co-workers throughout the day. She deflected most of them, claiming she had no idea what had upset the general, but privately she wondered if her tattoo had somehow connected to something from his past. The tattoo had been done 2 years earlier, shortly after her discharge from active duty. It commemorated her time with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment and specifically honored the memory of 8 soldiers who had died during her second deployment. The coordinates referenced the location where their convoy had been attacked, and the date marked the day that had changed her life forever. Among the names inscribed in the tattoo was Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison, a 23-year-old squad leader who had been killed while trying to rescue wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle. Sarah had been one of those wounded soldiers, and Michael's sacrifice had saved her life. She had carried the weight of survivor's guilt ever since, and the tattoo was her way of ensuring she never forgot those who hadn't made it home. As 2 o'clock approached, Sarah felt increasingly nervous about the upcoming meeting. She changed out of her work uniform and into civilian clothes, though she made sure to wear a long-sleeved shirt that would keep her tattoo covered. Whatever this conversation was going to be about, she wanted to control how much information she revealed. Building 12 was the main administrative complex, housing the offices of the base's senior leadership. Sarah had never been inside before, and she felt intimidated as she made her way through the polished corridors lined with military portraits and commendation displays. General Harrison's office was larger than she had expected, with a massive desk, several chairs, and walls covered with photographs, maps, and military memorabilia. When she knocked on the door, his voice called for her to enter, though she noticed it still carried that same emotional undertone she had heard earlier. The general was standing behind his desk when she entered, no longer in his dress uniform but wearing standard battle dress utilities. The change in attire made him seem more approachable, though his bearing remained unmistakably authoritative. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from his desk. Sarah sat down, keeping her hands folded in her lap and her sleeves firmly in place. General Harrison remained standing for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts before speaking. When he finally sat down, Sarah noticed his hands were still not entirely steady. "Miss Martinez," he began, having clearly looked up her personnel file since their morning encounter. "What I'm about to share with you is deeply personal, and I hope you'll understand why your tattoo affected me so profoundly." Sarah nodded, though her nervousness was increasing by the moment. "I noticed several names in your tattoo, but one in particular caught my attention. Michael Harrison." The general paused, his voice becoming thicker with emotion. "Michael was my son." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs as the implications of what he had just said sank in. Michael Harrison, the young man whose sacrifice had saved her life, whose name she carried on her skin as a permanent reminder of his heroism, was General Harrison's son. Sarah started to speak, but found herself unable to form coherent words. The room seemed to spin slightly as she processed this unexpected connection. "He was my only child," General Harrison continued, his professional facade beginning to crack. "Born when I was young, raised mostly by his mother after our divorce. He joined the army against my wishes, said he wanted to follow in my footsteps but do it on his own terms without any help from his old man." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the pain in his voice. She had wondered about Michael's family, had imagined the grief his parents must have felt, but she had never expected to meet one of them, let alone in circumstances like these. "He was assigned to the 508th PIR during his second deployment," the general went on. "I followed his unit's activities as much as I could without interfering, though he made it clear he didn't want any special treatment because of who his father was. The last time we spoke was 2 weeks before he died." The general's voice broke slightly on the last word, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composure. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between their ranks and the personal nature of what they were discussing. "The official reports told me he died trying to save wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle," General Harrison said, looking directly at Sarah. "But they didn't tell me who those soldiers were, or whether his sacrifice accomplished what he intended. For 2 years, I've wondered if his death meant something, if he succeeded in saving the people he died trying to protect." Sarah realized he was asking her a question without directly stating it. The weight of what she needed to tell him felt enormous, but she knew he deserved to hear the truth about his son's final moments. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "I was one of the soldiers he saved." General Harrison's breath caught in his throat as Sarah's words sank in. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah could see him struggling to process what she had just told him, his face cycling through emotions she couldn't begin to imagine. "You were there," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were one of the soldiers he died saving." Sarah nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, sir. I was the communications specialist in his squad. We were on a routine patrol when our convoy hit an improvised explosive device. Our vehicle flipped and caught fire, and I was trapped inside with a broken leg and a concussion." She paused, the memories of that day rushing back with painful clarity. Even after 2 years, she could still smell the smoke and feel the terror of being trapped in the burning vehicle. "The other soldiers in the convoy were trying to figure out how to get us out safely, but the fire was spreading too quickly. That's when Staff Sergeant Harrison took charge of the rescue operation." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke about Michael's actions. He didn't hesitate for even a second. While everyone else was assessing the situation, he was already moving toward the vehicle. General Harrison leaned forward in his chair, hanging on every word. This was the first detailed account he had heard of his son's final moments, and Sarah could see how desperately he needed to hear it. "He managed to get 3 of us out before the fuel tank exploded," Sarah continued. "I was the last one. By the time he reached me, the flames were getting worse, and part of the vehicle's frame had shifted, making it even more dangerous to attempt a rescue. But he didn't give up." Sarah pulled back her sleeve, revealing the tattoo that had started this entire conversation. "These coordinates mark the exact location where it happened. The date is when he died. And these names," she pointed to the list inscribed beneath the main design, "are everyone who didn't make it home from that deployment." "But you did make it home," General Harrison observed, his eyes fixed on Michael's name among the others. "Because of him." "Yes, sir. He pulled me out of that vehicle with seconds to spare. The explosion happened just as he was carrying me to safety. A piece of shrapnel caught him in the chest." Sarah's voice broke as she relived the moment. "I was unconscious by then from smoke inhalation, so I didn't see exactly what happened, but the other soldiers told me he used his own body to shield me from the blast." General Harrison closed his eyes, and Sarah could see tears forming beneath his lids. Did he say anything before he died?" "The medics worked on him for almost 20 minutes, Sarah said softly. "He was conscious for most of that time. The other soldiers said he kept asking if everyone had made it out safely. When they told him yes, he seemed to relax. His last words were about wanting to call his father." At this, General Harrison broke down completely. The composure he had been fighting to maintain throughout their conversation finally cracked, and he buried his face in his hands as sobs racked his body. Sarah sat quietly, giving him space to grieve while fighting back her own tears. After several minutes, the general composed himself enough to speak again. "We weren't on the best terms when he deployed," he admitted. "He was angry with me for not supporting his decision to enlist, and I was angry with him for what I saw as throwing his life away. Our last conversation was an argument about his future and whether he was trying to prove something by serving in a combat unit." "Sir, if I may," Sarah said gently. "Your son was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with. He had earned the respect and loyalty of everyone in our unit, not because of who his father was, but because of who he was as a person and as a leader. He was proving something, but not to you. He was proving it to himself." General Harrison looked up at her, his eyes red, but his expression grateful. "Tell me more about him. What was he like over there?" For the next hour, Sarah shared stories about Michael Harrison, the soldier. She told his father about his sense of humor, his dedication to his men, and his habit of writing long letters home that he never sent. She described how he had taken her under his wing when she first joined the unit, helping her navigate the challenges of deployment and earning a place in their tight-knit military family. "He talked about you often," Sarah revealed. "He carried a picture of you in his gear from when you were both younger. He was proud of your service record even if he was too stubborn to admit it. The other soldiers knew you were his father, though he made us promise not to treat him differently because of it." "He never told me that," General Harrison said, a small smile breaking through his grief. "I had no idea he was proud of me. Our conversations were always so tense, so focused on our disagreements." "He was planning to call you after our deployment ended," Sarah continued. "He had been working up the courage to apologize for how he had handled things before he left. He wanted to make things right between you." The general was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information about his son's intentions. "And now I'll never have that conversation." "No, sir. But you know now how he felt. And you know that his death wasn't meaningless. He saved 4 lives that day, including mine. Because of his sacrifice, I was able to come home to my family. The other 3 soldiers he rescued are alive and well, too. 2 of them have gotten married since coming back, and one just had his first child." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos until she found what she was looking for. "This was taken at our unit reunion last year," she said, showing him a picture of 4 people standing together, all of them alive because of Michael's actions. "We get together every year on the anniversary of that day, not to mourn, but to celebrate the gift he gave us." General Harrison studied the photo carefully, taking in the faces of the people his son had died to save. "You all look happy," he observed. "We are, sir. We've all struggled with survivor's guilt, but we've also tried to honor his memory by living full lives. That's what he would have wanted." "Is that why you got the tattoo?" Sarah nodded. "It's my way of carrying him with me wherever I go. All of them, actually. I never want to forget what they sacrificed so that I could have a future." General Harrison was quiet for several minutes, and Sarah could see him wrestling with emotions and thoughts he had been carrying for 2 years. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier than it had been since their conversation began. "Miss Martinez, I want to thank you for sharing this with me. For 2 years, I've carried the weight of our unfinished relationship and wondered if his death had any meaning. You've given me something I didn't think I would ever have: closure. Your son was a hero, sir, not just because he died saving us, but because of the way he lived and led. You should be proud of the man he became." "I am," General Harrison said, and Sarah could hear the truth in his voice. "I wish I had told him that while I had the chance, but I am proud of him." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before the general spoke again. "I'd like to ask a favor of you, if that's all right." "Of course, sir." "Would you be willing to meet with me periodically? Not in any official capacity, but just to talk about Michael. I'd like to hear more stories about his time in the service, about the man he had become when I wasn't looking." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since her return from deployment. "I would be honored, sir. I have plenty of stories to share." As their meeting came to an end, both Sarah and General Harrison felt something had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers connected only by a chance encounter in a mess hall. They were 2 people bound together by the memory of a young soldier whose sacrifice had created an unbreakable bond between them. Walking back to her car that afternoon, Sarah looked down at her tattoo and felt a profound sense of completion. For 2 years, she had wondered if Michael's family knew how he had died and whether they understood the impact of his sacrifice. Now she knew that at least his father understood, and that knowledge brought her a peace she hadn't realized she had been seeking. General Harrison returned to his duties that day with a lighter heart than he had carried in 2 years, finally able to grieve properly for his son, while also celebrating the lives that had been saved through Michael's heroism. The chance encounter in the mess hall had given them both something precious: the opportunity to honor Michael's memory together and to find healing in their shared connection to a young soldier who had given everything to save others.